Hi, we're talking to Valery Perry, who contributed an article to the special issue on the post-Yugoslav censuses on Bosnia-Herzegovina. And of course, it's one of the countries where the result has not been published 2 years after the census. So why is it that you're outlining the difficulties of the census? How does this not releasing of the results, what does this tell us of the difficulty of the Bosnian census?
I think the main thing it shows is that there's still no agreement on what the nature of the state and the country should be, vis-a-vis their preferential discrimination mechanisms, representation, quotas, etc. On an even more practical level, though, I think this demonstrates that while the census law was adopted in 2012 to great fanfare, the country was never really prepared to do it. They hadn't really gone over the issues of how do you define what a resident is? How do you define what an in-country versus a diaspora resident is? How do you explain to citizens which questions are mandatory and which are optional? None of that was done at the beginning of the process, as you would normally see in a normal state. But this probably shouldn't be surprising, as we often see that laws are adopted, but then the implementation and the devil is in the details.
Mm-hmm. But you're pointing out two sides. One is the technical unpreparedness of Bosnia, and the other one is the fact that there's this kind of sensitive nature of the census. I mean, and you're pointing out in the article that the conflict between the technical requirements of the EU and the international standards, which don't care about ethnicity and religion and mother tongue, and the Bosnian specificity where nothing else matters, and the only thing which matters is those three questions.
Well, I think that's where you get to an interesting clash about what Bosnia-Herzegovina needs to be a lasting, stable, semi-democratic state, and what they think they need to try to make some real or assumed progress towards European Union integration. The fact that well more than half of the census was funded by the European Union and others leaves one to really question why there hasn't been more pressure from Brussels to perhaps not pressure the politicians in terms of noting that those ethnicity questions were needed, but simply in letting the citizens recognize that this was a choice being made by politicians for their own reasons. And that remains unanswered, and very few people seem to have asked the European Union why they funded what has really become a farce in many ways. Technically speaking, I mean, the statistical agencies, etc., have the capacity to basically run data. But it's the stats people who are running the data, scanning the forms, putting in the logarithms, etc., can only do that if there's an agreement on the policy that helps them to try to figure out which questions they need to ask. So again, it's not that people are technocrats in this country are stupid. It's just that the laws are not being interpreted in the same way by policymakers, and funding from the outside seems to be going in exactly the wrong places.
You're also pointing out that the census results, that the political relevance is not as immediate as one often assumes, in the sense that the translation into laws in terms of quotas, for example, in many cases are defined explicitly in terms of the 1991 census. So in fact, even if the census results reveals, as we would expect, great discrepancies to the 1991 census, they wouldn't translate immediately into different quotas in public administration and so on. So what would the change actually be once this census would be released?
Nobody knows. I mean, and that's one of the things I look at in the article as well, is that the laws at the state and entity levels that do reference a census do so in two very different ways. Some of them reference the 1991 census, which of course was often referenced as a way to try to make up for the impact of ethnic cleansing, especially in the first years of the war. But then other pieces of legislation reference the last census. And those are two very different things. And absolutely nobody is speaking about this, even though the money has continued to pour in. And there's been no public discussion on this, either among civic actors or among policymakers, which is quite frustrating. So, to be honest, the jury is completely out as to how the actual release of any results could affect policy, because the policy is so completely incoherent, and no one seems to have the gumption to remedy that.
Mm-hmm. What was the reason, you think? I mean, in Macedonia, we know specifically that the census failed and was abandoned after a week. Now, there was a real fear that this might have happened in Bosnia. So why didn't this happen? I mean, there's this kind of mix. On one side, the census was conducted. On the other side, we don't know the results. what kept it from the Macedonia scenario?
I mean, I can only speculate on that, but I think in Macedonia, the scenario is a bit more clear because the numbers are so much more stark between the Macedonian, Slav, and the Albanian populations. And they've now had 3 failed censuses, so the political parties also know in advance how to best use and manipulate a census so that it fails. I think in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's a bit more sophisticated in that the main political parties all recognize that they have a very vested interest in the current status quo. And they all also wanted to create the illusion of progress at a time when everyone knew no progress was happening at all. And this way they could tick a box with Brussels, make it look like they were committed to the European Union accession process, and try to push the difficult, troublesome questions down the road to a point where maybe they would probably hope a lot of people would have already left the country, the international or the European actors, and have forgotten that these things are even important. So I actually do think it's calculated, and I think that the parties recognize that they had more to gain in the short term by allowing the actual enumeration process to go forward, and decided to just kick the can of counting and analysis down the road.
Well, thanks a lot, Valery. I think thanks for sharing these thoughts on the article as well. And I think we'll have to still wait for that can to be that we can look into this can and figure out what's actually inside it in terms of and of course what will be the political repercussions of that.
Well, I think whatever's going to be in the can is not going to be pretty. And just on a closing note, I think one of the most frustrating things about this entire process, and I've noted this in this article and some others, is that there's been absolutely no interest in trying to figure out how to count the people who don't want to fall into one of the constituent categories, the fourth voice that's been lingering for some time, which is always completely marginalized. And I actually do suspect that some of the reasons for the delays could in fact come from the fact that there may be more people in that fourth box than any of the 3 parties want to see. So it'll be interesting to open the can at some point.
Absolutely, and I think, or it might be the people who don't fit the categories neatly, right? Because again, there's the assumption of ethnicity, language, religion, that they all are one neat package, and in fact, in real life, we know that that's very often not the case.
Exactly, but it's much easier to manipulate people. You can shove them into one box and not let them have any sort of diversity.
Well, okay, so much more to be written and researched in the future, but a good starting point for now. Thanks a lot, Valery.
Thanks, Lauren. Bye-bye.
Bye.